divine presence. And these schools, we describe them, the schools of Baghdad, the schools of Khorasan, each had its own flavor, each had its own aura, depending on the nature of the form in which the Shaykh's ecstasy, and the way in the governing attributes, the governing names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which ordered his station. It attracted the kind of people who sought that approach, that path towards enlightenment. And we saw how these basically crystallized in the schools of Khorasan, the school of ecstatic intoxication, and the school of Baghdad around Abu Qasim al-Junayd, or the school of Sahwa and sobriety. And how the whole community of those who sought the inner dimensions of the deen, the inner path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reached a crisis culminating in the trial and subsequent execution of Hallaj. As a result of that, as a result of this cataclysmic event that affected nearly the entire community of those who sought inner enlightenment, and as a result of the recognition by the great masters that it was necessary to explain and to outline in clear form and to detail the parameters and the tenets of Tasawwuf, not in order to turn it into a school of Islam or a school of jurisprudence or a school of fiqh, but rather to dispel the erroneous notions that those in power and those in authority, particularly amongst the theologians, amongst the orthodoxy, may have had about Tasawwuf, and therefore led them to positions where they launched campaigns against those who chose the inner way. So towards the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th century, great shuyukh, some of them masters in their own right, began to organize and consolidate the forms of acceptable or moderate tasawwuf. And this is against the background, I'd like to add, where the Islamic world, the Muslim empire, was divided into a number of Shia sultanates and emirates and principalities. For example, the Buwayhid dynasty, Zaydi Shia dynasty, ruled in Baghdad. The Hamadanis ruled in Halab. The Qaramta, who were an extreme form of Shiism, ruled what is now Bahrain and Al-Hasan Qatif, and the Fatimids began to establish their proto-Shiite rule in Egypt. So the background towards the 10th century was, although the Abbasid Khilafah was established, the background was that of public expression of the love of Ahlul Bayt, because most of the ruling principalities and ruling emirates were led by people who were in Tashayyuh. So the link between, the formal link between the Ahlul Bayt and the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt and through Tasawwuf began to be more expressed and publicly acknowledged in that period. So the earliest classics that came out of that period, all of them were anchored in a deep love of Ahlul Bayt, and in particular Imam Ali alayhi salam, and strove to establish the legitimacy of their silsila, their chains of transmission to the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. And that, I would say, was the beginning of the public acknowledgement in the form of writings, in the form of books, in the form of treatises, and in public discourses of the Sufi claim, the right claim, that they are intimately within the school of the Imams. However, I must say that the links between the Shia of the 10th century, or Shia thought of the 10th century, and Tasawwuf as you understand it now, has not been completely examined in a satisfactory way. although a well-known professor of philosophy, who's maybe deceased now, if he is, Allah yarhamu, by the name of Professor Shaybi of Baghdad University, has established, I think, in a very critically acceptable way, the links between Tasawwuf of the 10th century and the thought and the practices of the Imams alayhi salam. So, following the crisis that the execution of Hallaj unleashed in the Sufi world, as it were, there was pressing need to start the systematization of Sufi thought in a way that the public can understand them, as well as in a way that would be understood and accepted by those thinkers, particularly the rationalists, the intellectuals of the Muslim world, and to begin to express the notions of Tasawwuf in a way that is within the terminological universe of Islam, particularly the Sharia as it was becoming formalized then by the four great madhabs and the thoughts and the sayings of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. Now, between Hallaj, whose execution was sometime in the mid of the 10th century, to the first book that came out that wrote about Tasawwuf, which is the book of Abu Nasr al-Sarraj. It's called Kitab al-Luma' fi Tasawwuf. This is the first book extant where the tenets, the expressions, the leading biography of the leading figures in Tasawwuf was written down in a way that could be read and understood by the literate general public. Abu Nasr al-Sarraj himself was a man from from Tus. His book, by the way, was translated and can be found in English by the great Orientalist Nicholson. Parts of Kitab al-Luma' has been translated by Arbery, and I think it may not be in print, but I'm sure all the libraries, at least of the universities, would have copies of them. I have not been able to find a copy in Arabic, unfortunately, although it's probably the major gap in the library that I have, although I have tried many times to locate it in Damascus and in Beirut, but with no effect. Sarraj really has a very lucid exposition of the main features and the main characteristics of what we understand to be Tasawwuf. In those days, the concern was primarily to establish the veracity of the claim of those seeking inner knowledge, and to confirm and to affirm it in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and in the Quran. So, all the notions that we know about and the various biographies of the early Zuhad and the early Sufis were linked to the great chains of transmission. And Sarraj began this method of confirming the relationships between the masters of Tasawwuf and the orthodoxy from that point on. Sarraj himself was a disciple of a great master, Ibn Khafif, who was based in Shiraz. And he could therefore understand the thinking and the patterns in which the great shuyukh express themselves. And in many ways it comes out in the book. The book that I have read is in English in translation, but Nicholson's translations are always very accurate, and I'm sure it reflects the spirit of the Arabic. Sarraj died in the year 998. His book is not that well known, unfortunately, now amongst those who read Arabic or those who try to understand part of the notions and stations of Tasawwuf by reading some of the experiences of the masters. The next book that was formalized was by a man called Abu Bakr Muhammad al-Kulabadi. The book is called Kitab al-Ta'arruf li Madhhab Ahl al-Tasawwuf, the book of knowing the sect of those in Tasawwuf, or the doctrine of those in Tasawwuf. Kulabadi's book has been translated by Abri also, and is known as the Doctrine of the Sufis. I believe it's still in print, and I think it's published by Cambridge University Press. It's a rather short book. I mean, I have a copy of it here. It's about 100 odd pages. And Kulabadi himself was a Hanafi jurist. He was a theologian, a faqih of the Hanafi school. So the book itself, although he was a practicing Sufi, the book itself is rather dry and presents presents mainly the stations and the tenets of Tasawwuf rather than the biography or the biographies of the great early masters. And he tried to find, I would say, a middle ground, as it were, between the then acceptable orthodoxy, in his case, the madhab of Abu Hanifa, and Tasawwuf. The book is very widely read, by the way, I believe in India and Pakistan now, and many commentaries have been written on it. The third book that came out of the 10th century is a book that is extremely well known in the Arab world, and was a cornerstone, of the references used by the great Abu Hamid al-Ghazali in his book Ihya Ulumuddin. And that's the book by Abu Talib al-Makki, who died in 996, and it's called Qut al-Qulub, which means the food of the hearts. As I said, Ghazali relied a lot on it, and Maulana Rumi quotes it many, many times in the Mathnawi. It is not so much a book on the definitions of Tasawwuf and various stations and the various hals, as much as a compendium of those and other things, including snippets of biography, including practices, mu'amalat. He has entire sections on how those in Tasawwuf should conduct themselves during Hajj, during Ramadan, during the fast of Ramadan, during their salat. And most of his insights were reformed and became common practice as a result of their being absorbed into the ihya of the great Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. These three books came out in the 10th century, and I think had some success in lessening the tension between those choosing the inner path and those claiming or affirming the need to maintain public forms of orthodoxy. And they are a bridge, as it were, between the period in which the Sufis came under some persecution, we talked about that last week, and when the great schools, the great tariqas were recognized. So it was again an interregnum, a period that moved from the community of those in Tasawwuf built around or organized around individual shuyukh to a more widespread notion of Tasawwuf, some of which appealed to those who may not have chosen the path, but who accepted the insights that were brought to their knowledge of the deen by treatises such as these that we've referred to. In the 11th century, towards the beginning of the 11th century, another set of books came out, which form also, with the first three that I mentioned, the basic canons or classics of Tasawwuf. These were more concerned about the biographies and the spiritual lineage of those in Tasawwuf. And the most important one was a book by Abu Na'im al-Asfahani called Hilyat al-Awliya. I have a copy of it. It comes in 10 volumes. And it is basically detailed biographies of those who, right from the closest Sahaba to the Prophet ﷺ, through to Ahl al-Suffah, to including the Imams of Ahl al-Bayt, and literally hundreds of people, some of whose names are completely unfamiliar to us, some of whose names are really a surprise when they're considered in light of Tasawwuf. Again, underlying this book, Hilyat al-Awliya, I don't think it's translated in English, it's just too big, and it will not have much of an audience. But again, bits of it have been used in nearly all the later biographies of the awliyas. And it's written in the same genre, as it were, as the great biographies of historical figures of Islam, emerged in that period, like Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, who wrote in great detail about the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, about the Tabi'un, and so on. So, parallel to the growth of literary biographies of the heroes, as it were, of early Islam and Middle Islam, we have the first collection of biographies of those who could be considered as luminaries of the path, and those who were in earliest zuhud, and those companions of the Prophet ﷺ who were known for their asceticism and their abstinence. Asfahani himself died in the year 1037. Another book in the form of a biography, series of biographies, had much more of an impact on later generations, and is probably the definitive work on the early Sufis, the early and the middle Sufis, and that's the book Tabaqat al-Sufiya, the classes of the Sufis, by Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami, who died in 1021. And this is probably the main source of stories, anecdotes, and histories of all the great walis that later biographies use. The book itself was expanded upon by the great master Khawaja Abdullah Ansari of Herat, and was again expanded upon by Abdurrahman Jani, the famous poet and the author of Insan Kamil, and the great interpreter of Shaykh Akbar ibn Arabi. And all the stories, nearly all the stories that we know about, say, Junaid or Sahil or Hallaj or Malik ibn Dinar or Hassan Basri, all of them or Ibrahim ibn Adham, Fudayl ibn Ayyad, all of these people, their life stories, their anecdotes, the way they came to the path, were all collected and compiled in a very, very effective and I think charming way by Sulami. In his other works, Sulami also began to outline the groups that were already then existing within Tasawwuf. So it wasn't just, the Sufis were not just one group. There were groups that were what he called hululis. There were groups who believed in the incarnation of Allah astaghfirullah in a person. There were the malamatiyah, those who drew blame on themselves. And he classified followers of the great shuyukhs in the way that might appear to be the germs of the tariqas, but it's not really the case, because these followers never systematized the way that they operated. So he discussed the Sahlis, for example, those who follow Sayyid ibn Abdullah, and he discussed the Taifuris, those who followed Bayezid Bistami, and so on. So Abu Abdurrahman Sulami's book is the key source of all information that was subsequently used as being definitive regarding the lives and the sayings of the great Shuyukh. He himself was a teacher, and many people, subsequent masters, emerged from his circle. The fifth great work of classical Tasawwuf is, I'm sure most of you have heard of it, it's called A Risala fi Ilm al-Tasawwuf, or it's known as the Risala al-Qushayriyah, by Abu Qasim al-Qushayri, who died in 1074. This has been translated into English and is very, very popular, I believe, in the Indian subcontinent, and is probably the most read and widely followed book on Tasawwuf. It includes not only the precepts and practices, it also includes short biographies drawn from Abu Na'im al-Asfahani's earlier work on the great masters. He was linked, Qushayri was linked to Abu Abdurrahman Sulami through Qushayri's father-in-law, who was a well-known Shaykh and possibly in his own way a master, Abu Ali Daqqaq, who was within the circle of Abu Abdurrahman Sulami. All of these people, by the way, are Iranian. Some were in Shiraz, but mostly were in the Khorasan area. And to some extent they are an antidote to the extreme emotiveness of the early Khorasani Tasawwuf, because their main concern was to anchor the path within the Sunnah and the Quran al-Kareem. Al-Qushayri himself was a well-known Ash'ari, theologian, a school which flourished then in Iran. The last book has dual merit. It is not only a great work of literature, but it is also the first great work of literature in Persian, which is Kashf al-Mahjub by Ali ibn Uthman al-Hujwiri, who died in 1071 in Lahore. The book is translated by Nicholson. I have a copy of it here. I believe it's still in print, and if you can get it, it's very, very worthwhile reading. It's extremely interesting. It is in some ways, some places funny, in some places very charming, but above all, it has extremely good insights into the path. And it's published by Luzak. Now, the company itself, I know, has gone out of business, but I'm sure it's available still. Hujwiri is buried in Lahore, and he's known as Data Ganj Bakhsh. His shrine is called the Shrine of Data Ganj Bakhsh, and it is an important shrine, I believe. A lot of people go there for his barakah. He wrote in Persian, as I said, and probably began the torrent, which came very quickly after that, of Persian mystical literature. And we're now talking about the debt that all the great writers in Farsi, from Ferdowsi onwards, including Rumi, including Amar Khayyam, Hafiz, they all trace back their use of literary Persian to this great work. He goes beyond just a description. He goes more into the stages and stations of the wayfarer. And in many ways the book is a precursor to the great compendiums that subsequently were produced by, for example, Sahrawardi and Awarif al-Ma'arif. That is, it is both a descriptive book, it is anecdotal, it is incisive, insightful, but it also shows for adepts and murids the way forward. For example, he has 11 chapters on the kashf itself. Kashf al-Mahjub means the removal of the veil, the uncovering of the veil. And he was the first to systematize the passage of the Sadiq from one stage to the final stage, which is the stage of Tawheed. And he starts the adept, or the true wayfarer, in the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he describes the various acts and the various hals, the various states that the wayfarer goes through. He passes through Iman, through Safa, Iman which is faith, through the station of Safa, which is purity. He's the first one to talk about actual stations along the path, and various stages and the conditions of each of these stations. He talks about the stage of purity, that is purifying the self, which is Safa. He talks about the station of being in permanent sajda, being in a state of permanent bowing, prostration to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He talks about the inner meaning and the inner station of zakat and sawm. Then he talks about the station and the adab, the manners of true companionship of those in the path. Then he also describes the terms and the meaning of the terms. This is several hundreds of years before these were compiled in ways that we now understand. And he also was a firm believer that sama, that is the condition where either sound or music in its refined and in its non-sensual form can be utilized to help in sharpening the awareness and the senses of the adept. He also describes, as I said, together with Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulaimi, the sects that were already beginning to coalesce around either teachers or around certain patterns of conduct. And the great differentiation those days within the world of Tasawwuf was between those whom they called then Ahl al-Ma'rifah, the people of gnosis and knowledge, and the Malamatiyah, that is those who purposefully or deliberately drew blame upon themselves. This was how the Sufis of the 10th and 11th century divided in terms of their outer conduct. The Ahl Ma'rifah are the majority of those in Tasawwuf who try to find a balance between their inner states, their inner conduct, their inner behavior, as well as their outer conduct and their outer behavior. Inner behavior and conduct was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and their outer behavior and outer conduct with the rest of society. The Malamitiya, on the other hand, were a group that in some ways were within the ambit of Tasawwuf, those who drew blames upon themselves, but subsequently emerged out of them. The actions and conduct that may have brought disrepute to the ideal of Tasawwuf. So there is the ideal people of blame who draw blame on themselves. Inshallah, I'll explain what that means later. And the practice of those who claimed that they were of the Malamitiya. And the practice of those who claimed that they were Malamitiya degenerated over time into what became popularly seen as trickery and chicanery and rope dancing tricks and all kinds of things that became somehow associated with those who claim that they are in a state of inner ecstasy. The ideals of the Malamitiya, or those who draw blame on themselves, is to take the station of ikhlas, that is pure sincerity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to its highest level. The ikhlas, or sincerity, that they taught was based upon earlier teachings by some of the great masters, including Muhasibi, that sincerity can only be demonstrated by a person who has absolutely no shadow as to the purposes behind his religious and outer conduct. Muhasibi, for example, said that any tendency on the part of any person claiming to be in Tasawwuf that leads towards exaggerated public piety, or even any form of public piety, or any form of ostentatious religious behavior, in and of itself is to be condemned. And that the true sincerity towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the true sincerity of a person who says he is reaching inner knowledge, should not exhibit that in one way or another, in any shape or form, in terms of his outer conduct. And that any form of outer conduct that exhibits religiosity, that exhibits piety, is a way of detracting from the true state of sincerity. So the Malamatiya, drawing on that, drawing on this absolute sense of sincerity and ikhlas to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, chose a way of deliberately drawing public blame, public opprobrium, public disapproval of their conduct. And in some ways, this public blame exhibited itself in them being completely indifferent to how the people viewed their and in some cases exaggerated indifference to their outer behavior, and even to the point of committing irreligious or unlawful acts, while claiming to themselves or stating to themselves that they are acting in a state of absolute inner purity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And apparently this group of people who drew blame on themselves, who were part of the community of Sufis of that period, created even then a sense of doubt as to their honesty and sincerity of their conduct. And this is this kind of outer conduct that is deliberately acting in a way that draws public condemnation on you, while maintaining a state of inner safa, inner purity, inner servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's something that is not really novel. I mean, most of the great religions, I know some of the early Christian saints did that. Some of them were actors, some of them were dancers, but they claimed that this is a way of hiding the reality of their inner state. The great interpreters and the great writers of that period some of them were neutral, some of them were condemned the Malamitiya, especially in their excessive form, in its excessive form. However, as I said before, their conduct that is driving blame on themselves also entered into the popular imagination. For example, I'm sure you have come across many notes or letters written in Arabic where the person signs his name as Al-Abd al-Haqir, the disgraceful servant. Or he compares a person who is in true state of oblivion, compares himself to a grain of dust, or says he is nothing but dirt under the feet. This notion of belittling the outer self in order to heighten the inner self became part of the public language, as it were, of Islam. And again, from that school, we have the Palandaris or wandering dervishes, who in their extreme disregard and their very basic commitment to the outer duties of the deen began to draw public outcry against the Sufis. So it might appear long academic and scholarly and long ago, but I think we can all sense that there is an element in Tasawwuf whereby the genuine indifference to the concern of people as to one's own state can lead to the attempt to create this indifference, thereby reversing the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to be in a state of true indifference, but when you choose to be indifferent in order that people may react to your indifference, you're basically designing yourself to relate to man, while the intention is not to relate to man, but to relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this state of ikhlas, this state of true sincerity, parts of it, in as much as it's organized in order to create public recognition of your indifference, is not permissible. Hujwiri in his book defines 3 classes of malamatiyya. Those who are in genuine ikhlas, those who are in genuine sincerity, who because of their state are really indifferent to what people think, but do not act to confirm that indifference. These people are in a state of lutf, in a state of grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these people are to be praised. That kind of drawing of blame as a result of indifference because of your heightened state is an acceptable state of drawing blame. The second state of drawing blame is sometimes necessary as a result of the self beginning to fall into its former patterns. And I think the best example of that is the example of Bastami, Bayezid Bastami, who upon returning to his native town from Hajj was met by a huge crowd. It was during Ramadan. And he began to notice the crowd. And because his nafs al-lawama, the blaming self, began to judge him, he did an unlawful act, which was to publicly break the fast in front of all of this crowd. He took a piece of bread from his saddle and started eating it. The intention was not to break the law. The intention was to drive people away so that he doesn't relate to their praising him. This type of conduct, especially by the masters, I see it from time to time, even now. Sometimes the great masters behave in a way that may appear to be unnaturally. It drives people away. It's unnaturally disruptive to the order. But this, for them to be in a state of true ikhlas, they are basically indifferent to what others around them may think as to their state. And that is, they are motivated in their actions, in their speech, in their hearing, by the state of inner sincerity, and not by the response of others. They may or may not hurt your feelings, or my feelings. But again, sometimes it is taken to extremes, and it leaves a condition whereby the person who is on the receiving end of a master's indifference may feel slighted. But this is not really the point. The third kind of malamatiya, or those who draw blame on themselves, is absolutely reprehensible and is absolutely condemned. And that is the state whereby the person does religious and unlawful acts and describes them as being as a result of his indifference. This is unfortunately the act of some of the wandering dervishes, some of those who feed on the public by behaving in outrageous ways, by exhibiting irreligiosity, by putting on all kinds of ridiculous garbs, all kinds of ridiculous attire, by behaving in a way that in and of itself is against the shar'. And they define that as, or they explain that away by saying that they are unconcerned about the outer forms and are only concerned about their inner state. This, unfortunately, as I said, has become one of the sticks with which people beat those on the path. They point out to the behavior and the example of those who are either in the borderline in terms of their devotions, in terms of their religious duties, or have gone beyond that and say, you people are cutting yourself from the confines of the Sharia. And that goes back in time to this malamatiya. This is really this lecture was going to be short, I knew, because it took on a certain necessary academic form. I mean, we had to go into a description of the various classics without actually going into their body of the work, because we don't have the time or probably the inclination to do that. But these classics, I think, influence us and impinge on us even now, because whatever are the great writings that we relate to, whatever are the great sayings that we relate to, whatever stories we have of the example of those great masters in terms of their outer behavior, in terms of their struggle towards the divine presence, we have received these stories, we have received these anecdotes, these discourses from these great classics. And these great classics have had a tremendous effect in formalizing and organizing in a systematic way the conditions, states, and the language of those on the path, which subsequently led to their systematization in the great tariqas. Wallahu a'lam. Are there any questions or observations?
Do you have any of the sayings of Ali Allawi?
Well, I mean, in this book, the book is divided into a number of sections. As I said, if you can find it, I would really seriously recommend that you all. It's divided into a number of chapters, and he starts by basically affirming that the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is possible through inner jihad and inner struggle. He talks then about poverty. He defines the meaning of tasawwuf. Then he has an interesting chapter on the wearing of patched frocks. I thought I'll discuss that, but how this became part of the outer garb of those in tasawwuf. And the patched frock is used. I know it's not used here in our way, but it's used in other tariqas as part of the initiation process. And for example, Hajuri quotes hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. I don't know whether it is Hasan or not, but he says, to translate, عليكم بلبس الصوف تجدون حلاوة الإيمان في قلوبكم. That is, by wearing wool, you will find the sweetness of faith in your hearts. And he claims that Imam Ali alayhi salam wore a shirt that reached to his fingers, because those days the fashion was to wear long sleeves. And any time he bought a shirt that was beyond his fingertips, he just cut it off. He also says in the book that Hassan Basri says that he saw Salman Farisi wearing a patched frock, and that all the great awliyas, from Malik to Sufyan al-Thawri to all of these people, wore a kind of patched frock. Even in his time, he was complaining about those who wore these frocks, claiming that they are Sufis, while in reality they're just interested in the outer form. So the ostentatious association with a group without being part of it, without recognizing its innermost secrets and paths and ways, was even then an issue. And he says, he quotes something which has come down in time about the wearing of patched frock. He says, لا فرق بين العباء والقباء, which means there's no difference by the abaya, which is in Arabic is the heavy cloak, or qaba, which is a frock. That means that whatever you wear on the outer really should not be the badge for what you really feel on the inside. But nevertheless, the event that they do anything wrong, it's basically a mark of signifying that to those of the public who see anybody wearing that in the event that he does anything against the Sharia, or he exhibits behavior that is not within the bounds of the Sharia, he is to be reminded of it by the public. So frock wearing is a kind of affliction. He says it's like wearing a mail coat. In Arabic it's joshan, which is a kind of heavy chain mail for those truly on the path. But he says because it's a badge, it is both an affliction for those who are in true tawheed, as well as a badge of differentiation for those who claim that they're in tawheed. So this kind of inner and outer dichotomy between those in true inner states and those who want to be associated with those in inner states, for good or bad reasons, doesn't really matter, was evident even in those days. And I think it's come down to us even now, the wearing of specialized garments that identifies people, or specialized techniques of shaking hands or whatnot. For those in Tawheed, it's a way of showing love and affection, as well as for the masters to point to people that they are there to be challenged and to be disputed with in the event that they do something that is unlawful. But for those of us who are not so perfected in our inner states, it can mean something else. It can mean a badge of membership or some kind of association. Inshallah, we will be of the former, not the latter.
You're the only one wearing a turban today.
No, this is not the badge. He has other interesting. He has a whole repository of stories and tales about. It's a very, very interesting book. It's a good work of art. And unfortunately, I do not read it in the Persian. I read it in the English version. But as I said, Nicholson does an eminently good job. Probably the greatest of the Orientalists.
Do you have any records of any other ladies Sufis apart from Rabia?
Yes, actually, there's a whole section on them in Hilyat al-Awliya. There's, I think, a whole book on them. That's before the 10th century. I have it in my library. Inshallah, I can bring it with me next time. I'll discuss that next time.
Could you just repeat the name of that book which you've got there?
It's called Kashf. Yes, Hujwiri.
Hujwiri.
Yes, Hujwiri. And it's called Kashf al-Mahjub, which in Arabic means the uncovering of the veil. And it's translated by Nicholson. Any other observations, comments, views?